Donald Trump was in the middle of a busy travel schedule when he made a stop in a small town in the heart of America for a private fundraising event. After the event, he was exhausted and craving a quiet dinner, something far from the crowd and the cameras. He turned to his advisors and said, "Find me a quiet place. A spot where the locals eat." One of them suggested a family-owned diner on the outskirts of town, known for its simplicity and down-to-earth atmosphere. When Trump's vehicle pulled up to the diner, the place was nearly full. The yellow neon sign above the entrance flickered, and the sound of laughter spilled out onto the sidewalk. Inside, the vibe was old-fashioned, wooden chairs, framed newspaper clippings on the wall, and the rich aroma of traditional home-cooked meals. As Trump entered with just 2 security guards, a few patrons looked up briefly, some quickly turning away while others whispered quietly. He approached the young server at the counter and politely asked, "Can we get a table for 2?" The server looked at him, then glanced toward the back. "One moment, I'll get the manager," she said, and quickly disappeared. A hush fell over the room. Trump could immediately tell this wasn't normal. He had been to thousands of events and venues, but hesitation like this was rare. Moments later, a middle-aged man emerged from the kitchen, wearing a flour-stained apron and a tired expression. He looked Trump up and down before speaking without pause. "Mr. Trump, I'm sorry, but we can't serve you here." Trump narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me," he said, his tone calm but filled with disbelief. The entire restaurant went silent. "This is a small town," the man continued. "Some of the folks here don't agree with your views. A few of our customers might feel uncomfortable with you here. We just don't want any tension." Trump paused and looked around. People averted their eyes, yet their ears were clearly tuned in. This wasn't just about dinner. This was about acceptance. About respect. He took a deep breath. "That's fine," he said. "I don't want to make anyone uncomfortable. But just so you know, the quality of a place isn't measured only by its food, but by how it treats people." Trump turned and began to walk toward the exit. But just as he reached the door, an elderly man stood up and shouted, "This isn't right. Everyone has the right to eat here." Another customer rose from her seat. "Join us, Mr. Trump. There's room at my table," she said. In just moments, half the restaurant was on its feet, showing support for Trump. The restaurant owner stood frozen, stunned by the response. Trump smiled, turned back, and accepted the invitation. He sat down and ordered his meal. That night, dinner wasn't just dinner. It was a quiet stand for dignity, a message delivered through kindness and restraint. And by the next morning, that small-town diner was making national headlines. If you enjoyed that story, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's dive into the next powerful story. The golden arches gleamed under the setting sun as the McDonald's on Main Street wound down from its usual evening rush. Behind the counter, Carlos wiped his hands on his apron and took a deep breath. It was his final hour on the shift and he was exhausted, but in a good way. He'd always been proud to serve his community, even if the work was thankless at times. That evening, something unexpected happened. A line of black SUVs rolled up, and out stepped none other than Donald Trump. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted instantly. Some customers froze mid-bite. Others fumbled for their phones. Carlos stood still, blinking as the former president walked up to the counter like any regular customer. Trump smiled politely. "Evening. Just a small coffee and a cheeseburger, please." Carlos nodded, trying to stay composed. "Sure. That'll be." He paused. A strange warmth hit him. Here stood one of the most famous men in the world, and he was ordering like anyone else. Something inside Carlos stirred, not political, not fan-driven. Just human. He quickly slid the order through the system, rang it up as complimentary, and handed the food over with a calm smile. "It's on me, sir. Just, thank you for stopping by." Trump raised an eyebrow. "That's kind of you," he said, genuinely surprised. "You didn't have to do that." Carlos shrugged modestly. "Sometimes, it just feels right." Trump gave a respectful nod and took his seat in the corner booth, away from the stairs. But the moment didn't go unnoticed. Minutes later, Carlos's manager stormed out of the office. Red-faced and stiff-jawed, She pulled him aside. Did you just comp a meal for him? She snapped. Carlos hesitated. I did. It was just. We don't do free meals for anyone. I don't care who walks through that door. Carlos tried to explain, but it didn't matter. He was told to collect his things. Fired, right on the spot. Word traveled fast. Trump, halfway through his burger, looked up and saw Carlos removing his apron in the back. Curious, he asked another staff member what happened. The reply made his expression darken. He stood, walked back to the counter, and asked to speak to the manager. The restaurant fell silent again. Trump's voice was calm but sharp. I hear you fired this young man for a simple act of kindness. Is that true? The manager, now visibly nervous, tried to stand her ground. We have policies. And policies are good, Trump interrupted. But sometimes people are better. He didn't hand me $1,000 steak. He gave me a cheeseburger. He turned toward the rest of the staff. This young man treated me with dignity. If this is the kind of place where that gets punished, maybe this place needs to think about what kind of message it's really sending. He looked back at Carlos. You've got nothing to be ashamed of. That was a classy move. Trump pulled out his business card and handed it over. You'll be getting a call tomorrow. I think we can find something better for you, something that values character. Carlos stood stunned. The same man he'd served 5 minutes ago had now changed his entire future. As Trump walked out of the McDonald's, the restaurant buzzed with whispers, not about politics, but about the way one act of kindness had turned into something unforgettable. You thought that was intense? Wait until you hear what happens next. The wind was sharp that evening, slicing through the streets of Chicago like a blade. The city was bustling as usual, lights blinking from every direction, people wrapped in heavy coats rushing to get out of the cold. Donald Trump had just left a private meeting downtown, his motorcade rolling slowly past the busy sidewalks. But something made him tap the divider. Stop the car, he said firmly. His security team hesitated for a second, exchanging glances, then complied. Trump peered out the window and saw a figure curled up next to a steam grate on the sidewalk. An older man, wrapped in tattered blankets, shaking from the cold. Trump opened the door and stepped out. The moment was unexpected. Pedestrians slowed their pace. Some pulled out their phones. Trump's security followed close behind, but he motioned them to hold back. He approached the man quietly. Hey, are you okay? He asked. The man looked up, startled, unsure if he was dreaming. His cheeks were red from the wind, his eyes tired and sunken. Just trying to make it through the night, he muttered, his voice cracking. Trump crouched down, ignoring the cold sidewalk under his knees. What's your name? Frank, the man replied after a pause. Trump nodded. Frank, you don't belong out here in this weather. No one does. A crowd was beginning to gather, watching this surreal moment unfold in the heart of the city. Some recognized Trump, others were just curious about the man in the overcoat talking to someone on the ground. He stood up and turned to his assistant. Get him a hotel room. Tonight. Full meals. And make sure someone checks on him tomorrow. The assistant blinked. Right away, sir. Frank tried to protest. You don't have to. I want to, Trump interrupted gently. Everyone deserves a warm place to sleep. As the staff made arrangements, Trump reached into his coat, pulled out a wrapped scarf, and handed it to Frank. Take this. It's new. Might help tonight. Frank held the scarf like it was made of gold. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice trembling. Trump's expression softened. Because someone has to. Later that night, photos and videos of the moment flooded social media. Some praised Trump's compassion. Others called it a PR move. But those who were there, who saw it with their own eyes, knew the truth. For one man, on one freezing night, someone powerful stopped to care, and that made all the difference. Moments like these remind us of the power of simple kindness. But what happens when that kindness is tested in a place where pride and pain collide? Don't go anywhere. Our next story will leave you speechless. The sterile white halls of the children's hospital buzzed with soft murmurs and the occasional beep from nearby machines. Doctors in crisp coats passed by quietly, nurses adjusted IVs, and parents clutched coffee cups while trying to remain strong. It was a place filled with courage and pain, where tiny warriors fought silent battles every day. On this chilly morning, something unusual was happening. Former President Donald Trump was visiting, his arrival unannounced to the public, but coordinated privately with hospital leadership. He didn't come with press or photographers. There were no speeches planned, no podiums waiting. Just him, 2 Secret Service agents, and a bouquet of small toys he insisted on bringing himself. As he entered the pediatric oncology wing, the air shifted. Children looked up from their coloring books and tablets, their eyes wide with curiosity. Parents stood, unsure of what to say or do. Trump offered soft smiles, shaking hands, kneeling down to speak with the kids at their level. It was a different side of the man the country often saw on television. In one corner of the room sat a boy named Eli, no more than 9 years old, pale from treatment, his head bald and his eyes unusually wise for his age. Trump approached him last, gently placing a small Lego set on his tray table. "Hey there, champ," he said softly, "that one's for you." Eli looked up at him, his voice raspy but clear. "Are you really Donald Trump?" Trump chuckled lightly. "That's what they tell me." The room chuckled with him, but Eli didn't smile. He looked Trump dead in the eye and asked, "Why do kids like me have to go through this, while grown-ups keep fighting about everything else?" Silence. Complete and utter silence. Even the machines seemed to pause. Trump stood frozen for a beat, the question hanging in the air like a weight. He took a deep breath, then slowly sat down beside Eli's bed, his voice quieter than before. "Eli, that's one of the hardest questions anyone's ever asked me," he said. "And I wish I had an answer that made it all make sense." Trump reached out and gently took the boy's hand. "But what I do know is this: you're braver than most of us out there. You're fighting the real battle. And you're not forgotten." Tears welled up in the eyes of several nurses standing nearby. Eli's mother, sitting silently in the corner, covered her mouth with one hand. Trump didn't say anything more. He just sat there for a while, holding Eli's hand, the room wrapped in a silence that said more than any speech could. "You won't want to miss this last one. It's the most powerful story yet. Get ready, our final story starts now." The lights in the Washington, D.C. studio were blinding. Cameras were rolling, producers were counting down in earpieces, and the audience was buzzing with anticipation. The night's guest? Donald J. Trump. This wasn't just any interview, it was the interview. The host, known for her sharp tongue and liberal stance, had made it clear nothing was off limits. And tonight, she was ready to press Trump harder than anyone had before. As Trump walked onto the stage, the crowd gave a polite but restrained applause. The host greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Trump returned the gesture, calm and composed. He'd been in more intense arenas. But he knew this wasn't just about policy, this was personal. The interview began with routine topics: economy, immigration, foreign affairs. Trump answered confidently, brushing off interruptions and pushing back with his signature flair. But then, the host leaned in, her voice dropping slightly. "Mr. Trump," she said, "many people say you lack empathy, even toward your own wife. Some say Melania looks more like a photo op than a partner. How do you respond to that?" The room went still. Trump looked at her, unblinking. Then, surprisingly, he smiled, genuinely. "You know," he said, his tone steady but softer, "real empathy doesn't always come with a camera crew. It's not about putting on a show. It's in the quiet moments, the ones nobody sees." He paused for just a second, long enough to shift the energy in the room. "When I ask my driver how his daughter's doing, because I remember her name. When Melania and I sit down together, away from the cameras, just to talk. That's real. That's us. And just because we don't broadcast it, doesn't mean it doesn't exist." The host opened her mouth, then closed it again. The audience was frozen. No phones, no coughs, no whispers. Trump went on. "Empathy isn't a performance. Sometimes the loudest act of compassion is silence." For the first time that night, the host didn't have a comeback. Not because she couldn't, but because she knew she'd been disarmed. The rest of the interview continued, but the balance had shifted. Trump had taken the most personal question of the night and turned it into a moment of surprising vulnerability and strength. As the segment ended, the host forced a smile. "Thank you for being here tonight, Mr. Trump." Trump stood, buttoned his jacket, and looked her in the eye. "Tough questions, but fair," he said. "I hope my answers were too." And as he walked off the stage, some in the audience stood and clapped. Others simply stared, reflecting on what they'd just seen. Because in a world of headlines and sound bites, Trump had done something rare that night. He had changed the narrative.